Hello to those of you who are just joining us. We will be starting in a couple of minutes. If you can put the name of your organization where you're joining us from in the chat, we would love to say hi to you all. We'll save the Q&A section for questions. So chat is just for chat for this presentation, and then Q&A will be for questions. Welcome all of you. We're so happy that you are joining us today. Thank you all for joining us for our keynote. If you're just joining in, go ahead and put your organization where you're joining us from in the chat. I did just see that today is Missouri Day, so happy Missouri Day to all of you. What a fitting way to celebrate all things Missouri with our kickoff to our Missouri Association of Museums and Archives conference. I also saw that Patrick Mahomes is having a girl they've announced, so we can all celebrate that too. So it is 2 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started, even though I know we have lots of people joining us. My name is Sarah Wilson. I am the current president of the Missouri Association of Museums and Archives, and we are excited to have Dr. Cynthia Prescott joining us right now for our keynote address. I would also like to thank the Missouri Humanities Council for their sponsorship. That's making this conference virtual and possible, so we appreciate that. Thank you to our Missouri Association of Museums and Archives board members and conference planning committee who have worked so hard to pull this together. We are up to 92 registrants, which is amazing. We weren't quite sure what to expect with the virtual conference, and I'm very pleased with those results. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Cynthia Prescott. She is a professor of history at the University of North Dakota. In her work, she combines social history and material culture to study intersections of gender, race, social class, and historical memory in the American West. She has published 2 books on these themes. Her first book, Gender and Generation on the Far Western Frontier, was published in 2007 and traces changing gender roles and ideology among 19th century white settlers in Oregon. Today, she will discuss some of the material in her recent award-winning book, Pioneer Mother Monuments: Constructing Cultural Memory, which was released in 2019. This book and research examines the portrayals of race, gender, and national identity in pioneer monuments erected in the US from 1890 to the present day. For us, she will focus on pioneer mother monuments in Kansas City and across Missouri. Dr. Prescott, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to let you go ahead and take it away.
Okay. Thank you for all for having me. I'm going to do my best to actually get the my slideshow up and running so that you can see what I am looking at. Okay, I want to double check that everyone can see my slides clearly. That coming through? Okay, as Sarah was just saying, my recent book focuses on pioneer monuments, by which I mean statues, public statues that depict early white settlers in the American West. And my book traces those monuments from the earliest ones conceived and put up in the 1880s up to the present day. And I'm looking at changing depictions of race and gender in those monuments in particular. And today I'm going to focus on Missouri's pioneer monuments and hopefully in the process give you a sense of the larger argument of the book as well. So the earliest monuments erected beginning in the 1880s tended to focus fairly explicitly on a depiction of racial hierarchy in the American West. They were making an argument that white settlers of the American West belonged in the American West, and that they were doing the right thing by claiming land, building farms, and building cities in the West. The first pioneer monument erected in the Missouri region first appeared at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904 as part of the art exhibit in that World's Fair. And it was sculpted by Frank Hibbard and called the Corn Planter. It was then purchased by a fairgoer and erected on the University of Kansas campus in Lawrence in 1916, where it became known as Pioneer. So notice how the work of planting corn makes this a pioneer in Kansas and Nebraska, Kansas and Missouri in that time period. Kansas City also erected a monument to Native Americans in Penn Valley Park, just outside downtown Kansas City. This sculpture, which was completed in 1910, toured the country and was so greatly appreciated that it was, when it temporarily visited Penn Valley Park in 1915, that local residents raised nickels and dimes to the total of $15,000 to purchase it and install it in Penn Valley Park as a permanent memorial to local Indian tribes. Now, the nearby town of Westport argued that they were the first city, the founding point for Kansas City. And their town seal emphasized Westport's connection to the early days of Kansas City and as its role as a jumping off point for the Oregon and California trails by creating a town seal that depicted early frontier life and particularly white and Native American trade in the time period. Now, the city of Westport wanted a life-sized wagon train monument to mark the centennial of the Santa Fe Trail, which was more commercial than transport rather than westward migration. That didn't quite come to be. But in the 1920s, as people across the Western United States and beyond erected monuments explicitly to pioneer mothers, Westport did manage to get this monument to pioneer mothers explicitly that was erected by the Daughters of Old Westport in 1920. The reverse of that monument includes a plaque that depicts that same image of a Native American and white trader that had appeared in a commemorative booklet raising money for this centennial celebration and for the efforts to erect a monument in the region. A local donor fell in love with a sculpture designed by prominent sculptor Asa Mr. Proctor, which was intended to also join that Indian Scout in Kansas City's Penn Valley Park. While many pioneer mothers in the rest of the country depicted women trudging westward, Proctor imagined a woman inspired by his own mother riding westward on horseback, carrying her babe in arms, while her husband and a mountain man guide, who's not visible in this angle, guide her westward. That work borrowed from imagery that was quite familiar to Americans by this time, that appeared in a famous painting by George Caleb Bingham in the 1850s, depicting Daniel Boone escorting settlers through the Cumberland Gap to what became the old Northwest Territory and opening up settlement to regions such as Missouri as well. And so we can see those echoes in this monument. Around the bottom of the statue is text taken from the book of Ruth from the Bible, which says, "Whither thou goest, I will go, thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." So this notion that women are self-sacrificingly following their brave husbands west in order to create future generations. Elsewhere in the country, the Daughters of the American Revolution erected 12 identical sculptures of imagery that becomes much more well-known across the country, the so-called Madonna of the Trail, carrying a babe in arms, young son tugging at her skirts, and carrying a Bible, or excuse me, carrying a rifle for her protection. She plods dutifully westward, and she represents then the coming of white civilization to the American West. These 12 statues were erected by the DAR in 12 different states, stretching from Maryland to California, marking the National Old Trails Road, they called it. And each of those states got one statue, including one in Lexington, Missouri, and in nearby Council Grove, Kansas. Now, St. Louis sought to also commemorate pioneer mothers. This work was originally conceived as commemorating women, all the women who lived in colonial Upper Louisiana under French and Spanish rule, the so-called colonial mother of the region. By that notion, it could be conceived as including French and Spanish women, as well as Indigenous and Métis women, Protestant, Catholic women, as well as Protestant women. But the Daughters of the American Colonists, who raised the money for this monument, and the St. Louis Art Commission selected local artist Nancy Kunzman's Hans sculpture, which she called Memorial to Pioneer Women. So the colonial mother goes from being a fairly inclusive image of women of various ethnicities who settled in and around St. Louis and the Upper Louisiana region more generally, to becoming yet another rendition of this pioneer mother imagery that was sweeping the country in the 1920s. This sculpture was, perhaps because it was sculpted by a female artist, was more tender and nurturing than the Madonna of the Trail and other pioneer mothers that appeared throughout the country. But it was small. It's only about 3 feet tall and then placed on a large pedestal as part of a fountain. Sewer excavation and other construction projects delayed its final installation, and the water did not actually flow to the fountain until 1941. The statue was then stolen off of its base in 1969 and was soon recovered, but never returned to public life. Instead, it's now held in locked storage by the Missouri History Museum. These kinds of pioneer mothers really became predominant in dozens of monuments erected in the 1920s and 30s. But interest in them declined after World War II, when Americans increasingly emphasized the American nuclear family in a time of rapid suburbanization and many young families joining the middle class. Family imagery, and nuclear families in particular, came to predominate in pioneer monuments. And we can see this in this sculpture from Prairie Village, Kansas, just a post-war suburb of Kansas City. Titled The Homesteader, you can see mom, dad, the baby, a wagon wheel. And this was placed in front of Prairie Village Shopping Center, serving to provide a historical context for the recent suburban housing developments going up around it. It later was moved to this traffic circle. More recently, pioneer monuments have gotten wrapped up in the ongoing culture wars that began in the late 1980s or early 1990s, and have ebbed and flowed up really to the present day. And so we see these culture wars playing out in pioneer monuments. Many American cities got interested in studying their own local settler history as part of the US bicentennial celebration in 1976. Initial plans to create a cohesive American birthday party, perhaps all held in one location, perhaps in Philadelphia or somewhere else in the vicinity of Washington, D.C., soon fell apart in the midst of growing identity politics and activism on the part of African Americans, Native Americans, and other ethnic groups who were calling for greater inclusivity and breaking down of traditional narratives of great white fathers creating the American West and the American nation. And so increasingly the US bicentennial celebration became focused on local and state level remembrances. And so local and state level organizations were able to choose the stories they wanted to emphasize, telling their local history and trying to weave it into an American national story. The city of Wichita, Kansas, erected this statue in 1976. It bears a fair bit of resemblance to early 20th century nude sculptures with elongated limbs and sort of exaggerated curves of this nude woman. That in and of itself probably made it seem interesting and appealing. It's a slightly updated modern take on early 20th century modernist art. And it became known as Heritage Woman, located in Heritage Park in Wichita. And at the time, the statue was fairly well received. I suspect that most people at the time, however, did not realize that the artist intended this to depict a pioneer woman who has stopped to bathe on the Trail West. Because many Americans still became convinced that still were convinced that pioneer mothers were proper women who wore long dresses and sunbonnets. This statue in more recent decades has come under attack by vandals who've come in and damaged or attempted to remove portions of the monument. As the culture wars raged, that monument has periodically been removed from display for repair and increasingly has been hidden behind a locked fence to keep it safe. But Wichita erected another pioneer woman statue just maybe a mile away on the riverbank next to the convention center. And this sculpture from 1994, titled Hardship and Dreams, shows the enduring power of that more traditional imagery that had first emerged in the 1920s and 1930s. So here, again, we have a woman in a wide-brimmed sunbonnet, long prairie-style gown, holding her young son by the hand, and lest her morality be in question, she's clutching a Bible as she walks westward. And this more traditional imagery gets repeated throughout the Kansas City area and the state of Kansas beginning in the 1990s. Mid-America Nazarene College, as the title suggests, a church school associated with a fairly conservative Protestant Christian denomination, erected this monument on their college campus in Olathe, Kansas in 1994. And so in this suburb of Kansas City, we have a Christian college campus erecting yet another pioneer family, but in keeping with the religious beliefs of the campus, we see a pioneer family at prayer. In this image, we can see again echoes of that Madonna-like mother with a baby. Notice that it's the father who kneels, and here we have a show of his strength, not by conquering native peoples, but by kneeling in prayer and leading his family religiously. In his hand is a Bible, in one hand is a Bible, and in the other hand, he's resting on a walking plow, suggesting that he is asking God to bless not only his family, but their work in converting native lands into a white settled region. St. Joseph, Missouri also erected a pioneer mother in the late 1990s. And this one shows influences that began to emerge throughout the country in the second half of the 1990s, depicting stronger imagery of women on the frontier. Here, rather than hiding under a wide-brimmed sunbonnet, we can see her hair flowing freely. She's not accompanied by a husband or heated by childcare responsibilities, but instead she stands proudly beside a wagon wheel with the title "No Turning Back," suggesting that while women might have faced hardships on the American frontier, she is determined to continue, right? That it's not just that she's following her husband dutifully, but it is her choice to persist and continue to work hard on the frontier. This monument then serves to show a balance, right? A stronger depiction of white women in a time of enhanced feminist activism. But she's not too brave, right? She still is constrained by the family work on moving west, as evoked by that wagon wheel. And she's still contemplating turning back and making a conscious choice not to. So while she is choosing to persist, it's clearly not really her idea to migrate west as well. Now, this monument is important for its depictions of pioneer mothers. It also evokes the next theme that I want to talk about, and that is the rise of heritage tourism throughout the country, and particularly in the Missouri region. St. Joseph, Missouri is well known as a jumping off point for the Oregon Trail in the 1840s, and also as an endpoint of the Pony Express route in the 1860s. By erecting this monument, they are portraying stronger roles for women and balancing other statues in the area that celebrate white men's involvement in the westward migration and the Pony Express experience. But they're also re-emphasizing St. Joseph's claim to being a particularly historic place, right? A place that has important ties to the westward migration. And this is a process that happens throughout the American West, beginning in the 1980s and 1990s. We have older communities staking a claim to heritage tourism visitation, right? Come see St. Joseph, the jumping off point of the Oregon Trail. We also see increased examples like we saw with the Pioneer Family monument we looked at earlier, an increase in new developments, suburban neighborhoods embracing pioneer monuments as a way to claim historicity, even when it's not very evident, right? When you have lots of post-war construction, but you can trace your local history back to early settlement in the mid-19th century, that then provides a different degree of cultural meaning to that post-war suburb, suggesting that you're not just some ticky-tack suburb. No, you are a place of rich heritage, even though most of the homes in it might be McMansions built in the last 20 years. Okay, so as I raise this question of heritage tourism, I'm now returning to an image that hopefully looks familiar to you by now, and that is the Mr. Proctor sculpture for Penn Valley Park in Kansas City in 1927. When that monument was created in the 1920s, the town of Westport, which you hopefully will recall, had erected a Pioneer Mother sculpture in 1920. They argued that this sculpture didn't belong in Penn Valley Park. It actually better belonged in Westport, because Westport argued that they were the founding site for what became Kansas City. And so there were efforts made to put this enormous, larger-than-life sculpture of 3 adults, 2 horses, and a baby in a small traffic triangle in historic downtown Westport. They failed, right? The sculpture was installed in Penn Valley Park dedicated to great celebration in 1927. But then, as other communities started embracing heritage tourism in the 1980s and 1990s, Westport tried again to claim the Pioneer Mother statue. Westport argued that nobody actually went to see Mr. Proctor's enormous sculpture, which, despite its great size, had largely gone unnoticed for decades in Penn Valley Park. It sits on a rise overlooking the city of Kansas City, and there were a circle of trees planted around it. There's a parking lot and trail leading to it near the World War I memorial, if you're familiar with that in Penn Valley Park. But the sculpture, despite being very large and on the top of a hill, was not very visible for people just passing through the park. An expressway had been constructed through the park, meaning that most people were speeding through at high speed on their morning and evening commute rather than meandering through the park on foot, and they didn't ever find the sculpture. The city of Kansas City fought back. The Parks District decided that the sculpture should stay in Kansas City, stay in Penn Valley Park, and they became gradually more interested in actually maintaining it. So Westport started exploring other options. They threw out the possibility of a sculpture of famous local residents, and eventually settled on this monument, which became known as the Pioneer Square Monument for Westport. Erected in 1986, instead of a Pioneer Mother, it depicts famous men connected to commerce related to Westport. Fur trader and Westport founder John C. McCoy, Westport businessman and co-founder of the Pony Express, Alexander Majors, and Western merchant and mountain man Jim Bridger, who wasn't from Westport but did retire there in the 1850s. So notice that Westport, after trying to claim a Pioneer Mother, and actually, despite having another Pioneer Mother already in the area, ultimately decided to depict prominent early businessmen in the area in the heart of what had been the historic business district of Westport. Not to be outdone, the National Frontier Trails Museum, which opened in Independence, Missouri, erected this statue in courtyard of the museum in 1990. And this is part of a larger trend in installing bronze monuments or statues outside of history museums, particularly in sites where there are not particularly obvious historical buildings remaining on the site, where they're trying to interpret a broader theme of westward expansion. For example, pioneer monuments or pioneer statues become a way of evoking that frontier life without having actual artifacts, actual trail ruts or something of the sort to have people come and visit on the site. Nearby Shawnee, Kansas, then erected this enormous depiction of a covered wagon moving westward, wagon train moving westward. along a busy highway, and here evoking wagon train imagery to emphasize the historicity of that suburb. Olathe, Kansas also erected this depiction of a stagecoach moving west on the Santa Fe Trail. It was sculpted by a Chinese immigrant named Quan Wu. And unlike the monuments that were sculpted by American-born artists, Wu aimed for greater cultural inclusivity. So there are people of different age groups represented. There are Hispanic and African-American individuals included, although, and in a nod toward the inequality of that era, we see high-class whites sitting inside the stagecoach, people who would have been of lower social status, people of color sitting on top or kind of hanging on to the outsides of the stagecoach. And while we don't see Asian immigrants represented in this image from the Overland Trail, we do have the boy holding up what looks like an origami crane. It sort of evokes a little bit of Asian culture influence in this scene as well. Now, not everyone loved this pioneer imagery as much as did those who erected these statues. The Pioneer Woman sculpture outside of the National Frontier Trails Museum was stolen, and the thieves then dismantled the statue and attempted to sell it for scrap. The scrap dealer, recognizing a bronze human hand, realized that this was a work of art, and ultimately the thieves were apprehended, but the sculpture by that point was beyond repair. And so the Frontier Trails Museum raised funds to replace that sculpture with a new monument that's fairly similar. On the left, we see the original monument sculpted by a Mexican artist who included use of color and some imagery that borrows from his own Mexican and Catholic heritage. On the right, we see the replacement by a white American-born artist who depicts, again, the sort of Madonna of the Trail, but without the bright colors that some had objected to in the 1990 version. Here we have a very safe rendition of a pioneer woman replacing her, and the statue has been placed out in front of the museum where they can better protect it with security cameras and the like. Okay, so these notions of pioneer motherhood still remain clearly very powerful. People continue to erect these monuments throughout Missouri and Kansas and throughout the country. But the fact that some of these monuments have been stolen, dismantled, damaged, even destroyed suggests that not everyone embraces them equally. I encourage you to explore further the monuments that are out there. And I'm going to suggest to you here in the last moments of my presentation some ways that you can learn more. First of all, my book, from which the research from which this presentation is drawn, was published by University of Oklahoma Press last year and should be widely available from their website, from Amazon and the like. I have also developed a companion website, Pioneer Monuments in the American West, and the URL there is just pioneermonuments.net. Within that website, you can read more about individual monuments, and there also is an interactive website and timeline and map on that website where you can drag the cursor across the timeline and watch these monuments appear over time as they are placed. You can see here, I'm showing you all of the monuments, the roughly 200 in my study. Those in the brightest colors are those that have been erected most recently. So as you scroll through the map, you will watch them pop up and then they'll kind of fade into that fainter color as time passes, as they become less prominent. And there's lots of other content there, and that website is very much a work in progress. So you can continue to watch for more information as I find time to add content about individual monuments. My website also features some model lesson plans developed by award-winning K through 12 teachers, particularly middle school and high school social studies class lesson plans are there. And each of them is targeted toward monuments or memory in a particular location or context. But I think that those model lesson plans will prove useful to many teachers as they seek to find ways to talk about monuments in their own communities. I am also active in helping contribute content to Clio, which is a mobile app and website that uses GPS technology to guide users to historic sites and cultural sites. And so within Clio, you can search for historic sites or cultural sites closest to wherever you are, close to your home, or when you're on vacation someday when this pandemic is under control and we're allowed to travel more freely. Any place that you want to explore, you can pull out the Clio app and just look at what's in your area. Clio also offers walking and driving tours, and I have built driving tours of the Kansas City area and the state of Kansas. I hope to build one in Missouri in the coming weeks as well. And so this is a way that you can actually get out and explore your region. Or if you are stuck at home during this pandemic, you also can explore these things virtually. The website or the app will take you there, show you images of the sites, and give you content about each of those areas as well. Okay, so that was sort of what I had to say, and I look forward to talking with you now as we move into a time of questions.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I liked seeing St. Joe represented there. So the first question that we have from our attendees is from Angela. It says, it seems like the focus was on gender in regards to pioneer mothers. Did you also find any connections between the erection of these pioneer monuments and immigrant waves, nativism, local racial tensions?
That is an excellent and really important question. I focused on pioneer mothers in this presentation because that's what I see as being emerging most clearly as an important thread within the Kansas City area in particular. These monuments, but those pioneer mothers do also evoke a racial hierarchy. They just don't do it as explicitly as monuments erected in some other places. So many of the earliest monuments I mentioned in passing were focused on this racial hierarchy. So most explicitly in San Francisco and Denver, where they actually erected a pillar with white civilization at the top and native peoples at the bottom. Those really explicit ones were erected around 1900, 1910. But we do see then these pioneer mothers also emerging as in response to racial terms. By the 1920s, most white Americans were less concerned about Native American presence in the West because most Native peoples had by that time been contained forced onto reservations. Many Native peoples had lives had been lost, and so they no longer were kind of it was no longer an open question who was going to win that battle, right? Whites felt pretty confident, I would argue, in their claims to Western lands. And so we see those pioneer mothers appearing in the 1920s at a time when anxiety about Native peoples is less prevalent, but anxiety about new European immigration and immigration from Asia is rising. And so I would argue that when people start putting up those incredibly similar statues of pioneer mothers in the 1920s, a big part of the message they're sending is that this is white native-born families who are coming to dominate. And it's an emphasis on native Protestant white settlers in the absence of other groups. And I think that's why groups such as the Daughters of the American Revolution are getting interested in 19th century history. right? They're not just worried about the American Revolution, they're also worried about the heritage of those native-born groups at a time of increased immigration. And we can see similar things happening with the culture wars since the 1990s, where whenever there is increased activism, then there's a pushback in erecting more conservative monuments.
So we have a question. Why is it so common for the pioneer women statues to be stolen? Do people disapprove of these depictions?
This is a really important question, and one that's hard for me to answer, in the sense that it's not clear what the motivations of these people are. The two that have been stolen in the Kansas City and St. Louis areas seem to have been motivated more on a financial level. It seemed to be the one in Independence, Missouri, explicitly was stolen and sold for scrap. So they don't seem to be, presumably they don't love the statue, but they see it more in a pragmatic sense of, oh, well, there's a statue that's not very interesting, but it contains precious metals. And the one in the case of St. Louis, that's less clear because they didn't immediately destroy the statue. Police at the time suspected that the thieves were attempting to sell it as a piece of art, but that was difficult to do, right? When you steal a public monument, it's going to be hard to sell that without people noticing what's going on. And so in both of those cases, it seems to be a concern about people who are more interested in economic terms and trying to steal and make some quick cash off the statue. But there are other instances that have come in the forefront, even especially this past summer, where there are monuments that are being torn down by protesters who are trying to make a political statement. So there certainly are pioneer monuments also that have been torn down or have been defaced, such like the one I talked about in Wichita, where I think people are objecting to the imagery in the statue or the message behind it. Either they're objecting to a nude pioneer woman, or they're objecting to depictions of white colonial settlement, as in the case of University of Oregon campus, for example, this summer, protesters tore down the Pioneer Father and Pioneer Mother statues on that campus because they believed that it celebrated white supremacy and that the university had opted not to tear down the statues even in the face of protest.
So I had a question. Some of my research kind of surrounds the Mormon migration. And I think you see a lot of statues of the Mormon migration in particular. Do you have any observations on those sorts of statues? Have you seen, I mean, I know that there are quite a lot of those around, and Missouri has a complicated history with the Mormon migration. So I didn't know if you could speak to any of that.
Sure. Perhaps not surprisingly, Missouri does not have a particularly strong Mormon heritage, monument heritage in terms of the Mormon migrations, in the sense that Missouri has a very troubled history with discrimination against LDS people and the assassination of Joseph Smith. The Mormon church, the LDS church, has not been very interested in marking that with bronze statues, right? These are places that are important to telling a particular kind of story from the perspective of Mormon heritage societies. But Mormon monuments tend to celebrate somewhat more positive side of that, which is emphasizing the roots of the Mormon migration from Council Bluffs and now the eastern Nebraska and following the trail west to Utah. And so there's a great number of pioneer monuments in and around the Iowa-Nebraska border where the Mormons sort of started out, their jumping off point, if you will, and along the trail routes and then in many communities in Utah, where Mormon memory is very strong, right? The LDS Church feels that believes that they were led to Utah by God in following Brigham Young, right? That this was following a prophecy, and so Mormon memory is particularly strong because it has a religious component as well as a historical component. And it also was a way for celebrating that trail experience, as a way for Mormons to present themselves as fully American, right? To help them sort of assimilate into American society in the 20th century. Oh, we're not some weirdos who practice polygamy like you might think. We're actually a part of this American story. And in fact, we're a particularly central part of it. And so that message becomes particularly clear in Mormon memory.
Thanks. Yeah, I really like your analysis that there's kind of a silence about the Mormon memory in Missouri, even though Missouri had such a significant role to play in that migration. So that's fascinating. I don't see that we have any other questions. So I guess, do you have any other thoughts that you would like to share with us, Dr. Prescott, while we have you on here about memory and statues and the importance of those things, or?
I did see someone just said in the chat they've got a question, so we'll give them a second.
Mary Stanfield says, wait, I've got one.
While that person is typing, I would just like to encourage all of you to go out and explore more what your local monuments look like, what's going on in your communities, and think about whether you think whether I've captured your local story, right? I'm trying here to sort of tie together 200 statues in 160 or so different communities that were erected at a different time by different people for different reasons. And I'm trying to tease out general themes, but I'm sure I'm not doing justice to all of them, or even to all the ones that I talked about today. So I would encourage you to go out and explore there. And if you know about monuments I don't know about, or you have more information about any of these local monuments, I would love to hear from you. The book is in print already, but my website is a living project. The Clio sites are something I'm contributing to, but all of you as local history professionals I would also encourage you to get involved in Clio, because it's a way to get your local museum presented. It's a way to tell your local history. And so each of you could also contribute to that crowdsourced project. And I'd love for you to add to correct my entries on Clio. Tell me what I need to fix on my website so that I'm representing your local history. And so here the question was, what that came through was, what is your favorite Pioneer Mother monument? That is an interesting question. I have a kind of troubled relationship with these Pioneer monuments at this point. I started out this project looking at Pioneer Mother statues in the 1920s and 30s, because I had studied Western migration and early white settlers in Oregon and to a lesser extent in California. And I was really interested in the way that these monuments, the way that people remembered those early settlers, and how their settlement experience was reflected, or how ineffectively it was really captured in these monuments, right? That the memories of what the trail was like didn't match up with what I had been reading in their diaries and letters from the time. And that's where this project started. But as I dug into the monuments, I began to realize that these statues did not just happen in the 1920s and 1930s. And in fact, I would go and try and visit these statues, go to local archives trying to research them, and I would have trouble finding them. The one that I kept returning to in Penn Valley Park, I couldn't find. My mom and I were driving through and we could not find this monument. And I said, this is ridiculous. I know it's so big that it has to be visible. We couldn't find it. I finally had to go back to my hotel. This is before I had a smartphone. Went back to my hotel and used Google Earth satellite technology to zoom in and say, okay, there it is. Now, how do I get there? That made me realize that this is a more complex story than just what people were saying and remembering in the 1920s and 30s. I began to realize that these monuments were living things, in a sense, that their meaning has changed over time for different communities. And as I delved into the earlier history of monuments that were not of pioneer mothers per se, but were depicting primarily white settler men, I also began to realize that I had been missing a really important part of the story, which is whiteness. I knew that they were depictions of white settlers. And I initially kind of accepted that that's the case because most of the people who were settling in these regions, most of the people who went west on the Oregon Trail were white. But it wasn't until I started comparing depictions of pioneer mothers to pioneer men and looking at depictions of Native people in art, in public monuments in this time period, that I began to realize that these pioneer mothers were really about constructing a racial hierarchy. Even though there were no people of color present in the statue, that doesn't mean that it wasn't about race. In fact, that was the heart of what the project was about. And so today, I don't know that I have a favorite that I can look to and sort of celebrate, because I can't look at these statues anymore without being really troubled by the ways in which they celebrate white settler colonialism and erase the lives of Native people who had lived in these regions and had been, in many cases, removed from them. So I have a kind of love-hate relationship with a lot of the monuments. I am particularly interested in San Francisco's Pioneer Monument because it's particularly complex in its depictions of race in ways I won't take time to go into today, but also because the community has responded to that monument. And in face of protests, the city chose to remove a portion of it that was seen as particularly offensive to Native peoples. It showed the early days portion of the monument showed a Spanish missionary towering over a Native American man. And many Native people in San Francisco since at least the 1990s have been saying, does me personal harm to walk past this monument. This monument's really offensive. And so the city chose to remove a portion of it and is looking at new ways to interpret that monument in order to reveal the ways in which it was problematic and trying to move forward. And so I'm really excited to watch that process. And I'm hoping that other communities will likewise pause and look at their own monuments in new ways and ask these questions. What is it we're celebrating here? Is this something we want to celebrate? What stories are being erased by our monuments, and how can we tell those more complex stories? That's how I hope we move forward with it.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate you joining us and being our keynote. And if people have more questions for you, can they just reach out to you via email?
Absolutely. So my email address is just my name. It's cynthia.prescott@und.edu. Or you can find me via my website, pioneermonuments.net, and I would love to hear more from all of you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And be sure and check out the new book. Is that book available on Amazon?
It is indeed, yeah.
Okay.
And it's available as an ebook as well.
And remind us of the title of the book.
The book is Pioneer Mother Monuments, Constructing Cultural Memory.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So for the rest of the afternoon, here's our lineup. At 3:30, we are going to have our annual MAMA membership meeting. So we hope that you guys can join us for that. And then at 7 o'clock, we'll have our virtual happy hour. So we'll get to have some collegial time to get together and chat. And then we have lots of great programs for tomorrow. I checked out on our break earlier one of our pre-recorded sessions on Missouri suffragettes. I encourage you guys to check out those pre-recorded sessions before our Friday question and answer session. We also had an amazing virtual tour with Gary Staub with Staub Studios this morning, and that will be posted in the conference material and will be accessible for those of you who had to miss that particular presentation. So thank you guys all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Prescott, for a very intriguing conversation. It was very nice to learn about your research on the Pioneer Mother Monuments in Missouri. And we will see most of our conference attendees a little bit later.